The Sleepy Village, Part 4. Every time Bruno tried to continue along the path, the black cat would run in front of him and meow loudly. Would it hurt to stay another day or two? If the cabin wasn't available, he'd ask the Swedish guy if he could stay in another. He walked back to the beach with the black cat next to him. The Swedish owner was still standing in front of the orange and blue cabin with his white cat on his shoulders. When Bruno started explaining his change of heart, the owner just nodded, handed him the keys, and walked off, ignoring Bruno's questions. The cat stared at him, as usual. Oh well, that was just the way it was here. He was getting used to it. Over the next week, Bruno tried to leave the village 2 more times. The first time, his escape was thwarted by a downpour and viciously strong winds. The second, he tripped on a rock on the path and fractured his ankle. There was no way he was getting out any time soon. The black cat had been by his side the whole time and very helpful with the injury. It was he who had brought the village doctor, an Algerian man of few words, to Bruno's aid. The Italians from the supermarket and the Senegalese fruit seller brought him food every few days, though they didn't say very much to him, if anything at all. The noises had continued, and Bruno had been having trouble sleeping. He felt terrible. One day, people stopped coming to his cabin. The black cat, Tiberius, still lived there with him, but no one was bringing him food. Bruno couldn't be bothered to go out. He had no desire to deal with the supermarket and restaurant's unpredictable opening times. He just didn't eat when he ran out of food. Surprisingly, he barely felt hunger. It had hit him after the first 48 hours, but once that wave passed, he felt fine. In fact, he was clear-headed and better than he had felt in days. Peaceful. The noises weren't bothering him anymore. Time passed. He still hadn't eaten. He'd heard of extended fasting. It seemed to be working. His ankle felt better. One night, just after midnight, he decided the time had come. Time to go home, time to get back to his life. He gathered his belongings, petted Tiberius, and opened the door. In front of him stood the Swedish owner, with his white cat around his shoulders. Whatever could he want at this hour?
"Can I come in?"
The man asked. It was the first time he'd initiated a conversation. He took a seat in a large orange armchair and asked whether Bruno was unhappy with the cabin or the village. When Bruno answered that everything had been fine, the man perplexedly inquired why he was leaving. When Bruno answered that it was time to go home, the Swedish man fell silent. When he spoke again, he began hesitantly, almost reluctantly.
"Why must you return? What's waiting for you there? Work? Is there an emergency? Aren't you living your dream here? A quiet, simple life in a small village far from daily stress and chaos?"
Taken aback by the sudden loquacity of the usually silent villager, Bruno just replied, "But how do you know that?" The man answered with another series of questions. Didn't Bruno find the emptiness of the village strange? And what about the weird opening times and lack of services? And the whispers and noises, of course. Had he heard the whispers and noises? Yes! What are those? Look. The man waved his hand, and before him, on the blue sofa, sat two children laughing while looking through a picture book. A man was walking through the living room, holding a lamp, telling them it was time for bed. They all disappeared with another wave of the Swedish owner's hand. What? Who are these people? Bruno managed to utter.
The living.
When Bruno had crossed the street the morning of his trip to Uruguay, he'd been run over. He'd been hoping to leave the city later that week, when he was run over and killed. It had been so sudden and terrible that his spirit hadn't witnessed the event. People like Bruno, who had spent their whole lives delaying trips and activities they really wanted to do, who had constantly put off what mattered, ended up here, the village of the dead, who hadn't escaped the hectic daily routine they detested. The village didn't appear to them as it did to the living. They came from all over the world. It was also why there were no real restaurants or supermarkets. They did not need food, as Bruno had seen for himself during his extended fast. From time to time, sounds seeped into the village of the dead from the living world where tourists flock to this quaint place in rural Uruguay. When a newcomer like Bruno arrived, they tried to help him transition with a semblance of services and food. The hope was that he would adapt to the solitary, silent life in Cabo Polonio, and that he would lose his appetite for entertainment, food, busyness, and other distractions. They hoped he would let go of the short-lived pleasure these brought and instead embrace the contentment of the place he'd never managed to reach while alive. The hope was that he would lose the desire to leave and eventually forget the living world and who he was there. If it didn't happen, they eventually broke the news, though they would rather have not. And that was how, in death, Bruno came to find the absence of desire and peace he had longed for all his life. Tiberius and he remained in the orange and blue cabin by the sea. Cabo Polonio wouldn't be what it is without cats. These ethereal creatures, by nature calm and content, are venerated in the village, where they serve as a model and symbol for the good life.